The scent of frost and old rust clung to the stones of Ironfall Keep, settling deep into the marrow of Corenza Thorne's bones. She kept her head bowed against the frozen granite wall, her breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the frigid air of the outer dungeon cells. The cold down here was not merely a seasonal weather shift. It was a living, breathing entity that aggressively sucked the heat from her veins. Built into the jagged side of a mountain, the lowest levels of the royal fortress were submerged in perpetual, sunless winter. Dampness wept from the ceiling, crystallizing into jagged ice before it ever reached the uneven floor. In the darkest, most isolated corner of this subterranean nightmare, the young woman sat perfectly still. She had long passed the point of shivering. Her battered body was frantically conserving whatever miserable fraction of energy remained, drawing her blood away from her extremities and clustering it around her sluggish, failing heart. Her wrists were pinned to the stone by heavy, silver-shackled bonds. They were not standard iron cuffs meant for ordinary criminals. These restraints were magically forged, intricate suppression runes carved deeply into the dull grey metal. The silver bit into her pale skin, leaving angry, bruised welts that the freezing temperature refused to let heal. The enchanted metal acted as a constant venom in her bloodstream, actively suppressing her inner wolf and drowning her beast in a heavy sea of unnatural lethargy. Every slight shift of her arms sent a sickening wave of nausea through her stomach, a brutal reminder of her absolute helplessness. She was an Omega, the lowest rank within the brutal pack hierarchy, cast into this frozen abyss on false charges of thievery, simply because her existence had offended the wrong noble. Yet, the physical agony of the silver was nothing compared to the devastating emptiness echoing inside her chest. Beneath the chafed, bruised skin of her left wrist lay the lunar claiming mark. It was a delicate, crescent-shaped scar, a divine branding from the moon goddess that should have been her greatest source of strength. For a true mate, the mark was meant to be a hearth fire, a constant source of molten, golden warmth that connected her soul to her designated alpha. But King Kalin Thornemere was far away, patrolling the hostile northern borders, utterly unaware of the starving prisoner who carried the other half of his soul. His prolonged absence was a literal, physical weight crushing her lungs. Because the sacred bond remained unacknowledged and unconsummated, it created a cavernous void inside her ribs. The empty mark pulsed with a freezing numbness, a severe somatic reflection of his distance. It was actively cannibalizing her internal magic to keep the faint thread of their connection alive, leaving her suffering from acute, agonizing bond deprivation. Every breath she took felt like inhaling shattered glass, the sheer physical toll of being unacknowledged draining the last reserves of her vitality. She could feel the vast, terrifying empty space in her soul, where his protective presence belonged. A hollow void that threatened to consume her entirely before the winter even had a chance. The rusty screech of the cell block door echoed down the long, dark corridor, shattering the heavy silence. Corenza did not look up, her chin resting against her collarbone, but her dulled senses picked up the erratic, terrified heartbeat approaching her cage. The hurried footsteps belonged to Brenna Frostwood. The elder Omega servant carried the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke, old wool, and intense, suffocating fear. Brenna slipped through the deep shadows, her stooped shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow from the darkness itself. The older woman knelt hurriedly before the iron grates, her gnarled, trembling hands pushing a small hardened crust of bread and a dented tin cup of water through the narrow gaps. "Eat, child," the servant whispered, her voice cracking with suppressed tears. "You must eat quickly. The guards are drinking in the upper hall, but they will return soon." Corenza slowly lifted her head, her storm-grey eyes, sunken and shadowed from weeks of starvation, met the elder's tear-filled gaze. She accepted the meager offering with trembling fingers, careful not to let the silver-shackled bonds clank against the stone. She did not complain about the hardness of the bread. She did not beg for a blanket or a warmer cell. She merely brought the stale food to her cracked lips, forcing her parched throat to swallow the dry crumbs. Her silent resilience broke the older woman's heart far more than any weeping could have. "They have forgotten you down here," Brenna murmured, wiping a stray tear from her wrinkled cheek. "The Beta has forbidden anyone from checking this block. They want the winter to take you, Corenza. They want you to quietly disappear. We are small things in a world of teeth, my Corenza," her late mother had whispered long ago, hiding her in a dark root cellar during a brutal territory raid. "Smallness is a gift. Use it." Corenza had adapted that ancestral lesson perfectly to her tragic life. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. She had embraced her low status, her complete invisibility, surviving the ruthless politics of the royal court by simply becoming a shadow sweeping the grand halls. But shadows still felt the biting cold. Shadows still ached when heavy metal tore their skin and the crushing weight of isolation pressed down upon them. She took a slow sip of the icy water, letting the freezing liquid numb the raw, burning ache in her parched throat. "I am fine, Brenna," the young Omega rasped, her voice barely more than a dry rustle of autumn leaves. "You must not risk coming here again. If they catch you feeding a condemned prisoner, they will string you up in the courtyard." Before the elder servant could protest, a new sound vibrated through the damp floorboards overhead. Heavy, authoritative footfalls descending the spiral stone staircase. Brenna gasped in sheer terror, her eyes widening in panic. She snatched the empty tin cup from the floor, scrambling backward away from the iron bars. Without another word, the terrified woman fled, back into the labyrinth of the upper servant corridors, her footsteps fading into the oppressive silence of the subterranean jail. Corenza slumped back against the freezing granite, her exhausted muscles screaming in protest. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sink back into the numb, detached state of survival. She tried to focus on the faint, distant pulse of the king's heartbeat echoing through her frozen, claiming mark, searching for a tiny scrap of comfort in the dark. But the silence was abruptly shattered again. The heavy boots did not stop at the upper landing. They marched directly into the outer dungeon corridor. The harsh, flickering light of a pitch torch bled into the darkness, casting long, monstrous shadows across the damp stone walls. The scent of expensive spiced wine, cured leather, and violent, unbridled ambition rolled down the hallway, suffocating the metallic smell of rust. Beta Varric Vance had arrived, the treacherous second-in-command of Ironfall Keep, strode down the cell block with absolute, arrogant confidence. He was draped in a thick, luxurious cloak of midnight fur, secured at his broad shoulders by gleaming clasps shaped like snarling wolf skulls. The warmth radiating from his well-fed, powerful frame was a sharp, cruel contrast to the freezing, starving Omega chained just a few yards away. Varric did not even cast a glance toward Corenza's pitch-black cell. To him, the prisoner in the dark was nothing more than a ghost, a worthless problem he had already solved. He assumed she was deaf, unconscious, or too close to death to comprehend anything happening around her. He did not come alone. 2 other sets of heavy boots followed him, pausing just outside her cell block in the small, illuminated guard post. The men dragged heavy wooden chairs across the floorboards, settling around a makeshift table. "Is the perimeter secured?" Varric demanded, his voice low but carrying effortlessly through the echoing stone corridor. "The guards have been paid off or reassigned to the southern watchtowers," a raspy, nervous voice replied. "No one will disturb us down here, my lord." Corenza held her breath, her chest tightening. She pressed her spine flat against the freezing wall, willing her heart to slow its frantic beating. Through the narrow iron grates of her cage, she could see the flickering orange light illuminating the Beta's cruel, angular face. A dry, crisp sound echoed through the damp air, the distinct rustle of thick, heavy parchment unrolling against the wooden table, the war map. Varek's manicured finger tapped rhythmically against the center of the unrolled document. The King's patrol is expected to cross the mountain pass by tomorrow morning, the Beta murmured, his tone dripping with a cold, calculated malice. The sudden blizzard has severely slowed his vanguard. He will be exhausted, his men will be freezing, and his royal beast will be half blind from the snow glare. And his elite guard? The nervous conspirator asked, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. They never leave his flanks. They are the fiercest warriors in the realm. Varek chuckled, a dark grinding sound that made the hairs on the back of Corenza's neck stand on end. The gorge narrows, significantly at the weeping cliffs of the Whispering Peaks. The path is barely wide enough for 2 horses to walk abreast. We have already positioned our armed forces on the high ridges, waiting unseen in the whiteout conditions. The Beta leaned closer to the map, his shadow looming large against the dungeon wall. We seal the pass behind them with a calculated collapse, completely cutting off his retreat and trapping the vanguard in the narrowest part of the ice corridor. Then the ambush begins from above. Kalin will not survive the trap. His elite guards will be pinned down, unable to climb the sheer, slick walls to reach our archers. By noon tomorrow, the bitter winter snow will bury their bodies. I will wear the crown of Ironfall, and the Thornemere line will be permanently extinguished. The dawn patrol was supposed to be a routine border check. Instead, it became the moment Corenza Thorne's entire world shattered. The treacherous words hit her, not merely as sound, but as a devastating physical blow to her sternum. The crescent brand on her left wrist, previously a block of dead, numbing ice, suddenly erupted in a violent, white-hot flare of agony. The dormant soul bond was screaming, reacting instinctively to the impending, lethal threat against its anchor. The sudden rush of searing heat sliced through the silver poison in her veins, shocking her failing nervous system back into sharp, terrifying awareness. Her suppressed wolf, starved, beaten, and buried under weeks of magical suppression, clawed wildly against the inside of her ribs. It let out a silent, desperate roar of panic. The primal, undeniable instinct to protect her fated mate violently overrode the crippling exhaustion of her starvation. King Kalin was riding directly into a slaughter, the powerful, intimidating sovereign who held the other half of her soul. The man who did not even know her true name, who had only ever seen her as a faceless servant pouring wine at the high table, was hours away from being brutally butchered in the mountain snow. His massive, legendary beast would be trapped in a narrow gorge, torn apart by an ambush orchestrated by the very man he trusted to rule his keep, and no one in the sprawling fortress knew about the betrayal, except the condemned, forgotten girl chained in the dark. "Send the final messenger bird to the ridge commanders," Varek ordered, rolling up the heavy parchment with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Tell them to hold their fire until the Alpha King reaches the center marker. I want his head severed before the sun reaches its peak." The conspirators scraped their chairs backward, their cruel laughter echoing off the damp walls as they turned to leave the guard post. They picked up their pitch torches, the flickering light slowly retreating up the corridor. They left the outer dungeon cells to the dark, fully assuming the enchanted chains would securely hold the lowly prisoner until the bitter winter cold quietly claimed her pathetic life. They were catastrophically wrong, because when Corenza looked down at the heavy runic metal binding her frail arms to the stone, she did not see an impossible, permanent barrier. She saw the only obstacle standing between her distant mate and his absolute destruction. The searing heat from her claiming mark was spreading up her arm, pumping a frantic, desperate adrenaline through her withered muscles. She could not wait for a miraculous rescue. No guards were coming to save her. No divine intervention would unlock the rusted cell door. She had to become the rescue, even if it destroyed her in the process. The young Omega slowly lifted her shackled wrists toward her face in the pitch-black silence of the dungeon. She inhaled a sharp, ragged breath, the scent of ancient stone and freezing frost filling her senses. Her tempestuous gaze shifted for a fraction of a second, flashing with the wild, feral gold of her awakened inner beast. Without a single whimper of hesitation, Corenza opened her jaw. She brought her teeth down against the unyielding, poisoned silver. The sheer primal instinct to protect her fated mate surged through her bloodstream, overriding the magical suppression. Her dormant power flared into terrifying, desperate strength, driving her to bite, pull, and completely shatter the impossible chains that held her back from the man she was destined to save. The metallic tang of the silver-shackled bonds flooded Corenza Thorne's mouth. The metal was magically frozen, carrying a sub-zero bite that instantly seared the delicate tissue of her lips. She clamped her jaw down with bone-jarring force. The ancient runes carved into the heavy restraints flared with a toxic, sickly violet light, attempting to violently reject her touch. These enchanted shackles were masterworks of cruelty, designed by the ancient architects of Ironfall. Keep to suppress a werewolf's shift by poisoning the blood. They were meant to turn natural, feral strength into a debilitating, nauseating weakness, reducing the proudest warriors to helpless, weeping prisoners. But those corrupt architects had never accounted for the sheer, world-bending magnitude of a severed soul bond fighting for its survival. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack hierarchy. Worse, she was a rejected Omega, cast aside and forgotten in the darkest corner of his towering fortress because her wolf was considered defective. She could not shift fully. She was deemed fundamentally broken. What could a starving prisoner possibly offer a sovereign? The answer was currently pounding fiercely against her ribs. The divine soul stamp on her left arm throbbed with a blinding molten heat. It was a searing, miraculous contrast to the dungeon's aggressive frost, pulsing in perfect, frantic rhythm with the distant, panicked heartbeat of Kalin Thornemere. Every time the Alpha King's heavy pulse echoed across the vast, empty void in her chest, the crescent-shaped scar pumped a fresh, desperate wave of liquid fire directly into her veins. That ancestral, golden warmth clashed violently with the cold silver poison trying to keep her docile. The hollow mark on her skin didn't just contain her power. It created a void, an absence where her magic should be. Until the threat to her fated mate shattered that absence entirely. The conflicting magics warred inside her frail body, turning her bloodstream into a terrifying, exhausting battlefield. Corenza ground her molars against the unyielding, runic metal. The enchanted iron fought her desperation, sending a blinding ache, radiating upward through her skull. She tasted her own blood, rich and vital, mixing with the bitter, acidic frost of the silver. She did not stop, she did not complain, she did not beg. She merely adjusted her trembling grip, her silver irises glowing with a terrifying feral gold in the absolute darkness of the pit. She paid no mind to the blinding agony radiating through her face. She gave no thought to the brutal physical toll she was inflicting upon her own frail body to break free. She only cared about the invisible, somatic thread of the fated mate bond. It was currently pulling taut across the miles of blinding snow, acting as a screaming alarm that warned her that her true king was marching blindly toward an icy grave. The realization as of his impending death eclipsed all of her own suffering, because when she had seen him last, a towering alpha burdened by his crown, something in her roared that she had to save him, even if saving him destroyed her. The young Omega shifted her awkward angle, targeting the heavily worn, rusted joint where the thick silver cuff met the iron anchor chain. Her breath came in ragged, wet, desperate gasps that plumed into thick white vapor in the freezing dungeon air. With her inner beast completely awakened and driven to madness by the impending threat to her mate, Corenza's jaw strength bypassed ordinary human limitations. The feral gold light bled from her sunken eyes, settling deep in her exhausted muscles. She bit down again, pushing past the absolute breaking point of physical endurance. She actively ignored the blinding flash of white pain exploding behind her eyes. She clamped down harder, channeling every ounce of her dormant lunar magic into the desperate pressure. A sharp, high-pitched whine vibrated violently from the silver-shackled bonds. The dark suppression runes began to fracture under the impossible primal strain, and the volatile, molten magic radiating from her lunar claiming mark. The metal hissed like a dying serpent, searing the side of her bruised cheek, but Corenza absolutely refused to let go. With a final agonizing surge of feral strength, she ripped her head backward with a violent, savage jerk. The rusted iron joint completely shattered. The sudden, explosive release of tension sent her crashing backward against the frozen granite wall. The heavy anchor chain clattered uselessly to the uneven stone floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent prison. However, the thick silver cuffs remained securely locked around her bruised wrists. They were no longer tethered to the dungeon wall, but they were still biting deeply into her torn flesh, dragging her frail arms down with their immense enchanted weight. She lay there in the dark for a long, agonizing minute, staring blankly up at the weeping, icy ceiling, her chest heave with violent tremors. The heavy, oppressive silence of the outer cell block returned, broken only by the wet, ragged sound of her breathing. She slowly, painfully raised her hands into her field of vision. The heavy cuffs had exacted a severe toll during her violent escape, leaving deep, agonizing wounds circling her forearms where the raw restraints dug into her skin. Her hands trembled uncontrollably from the deep systemic shock, her fingers completely numb and slick with her own fresh blood. But as she pressed her injured wrists against her chest, the agonizing, rhythmic throb of her claiming mark brutally reminded her that the true pain was yet to come. The Alpha King was still moving. Beta Varek's treacherous ambush was still waiting in the merciless snow. The conspirators had underestimated her, treating her like an invisible ghost in her own home. But a girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never truly understood to begin with. Corenza dragged her battered body off the freezing floor. She forced herself to ignore the screaming protest of her starved muscles. The sprawling subterranean dungeon was entirely still. The corrupt guards had not returned. Beta Varek's arrogant assumption that she was broken beyond repair had left her entirely unwatched and forgotten. She moved silently, like a phantom, toward the back of her pitch-black cell, where a narrow, rusted iron grate offered a tiny, miserable glimpse of the violent world outside. The iron grate was positioned high on the thick stone wall, originally designed by the builders for meager ventilation rather than providing light. It was barely wider than her own narrow, starved shoulders. The heavy iron bars were thick with centuries of corrosive red rust and heavily encrusted with jagged layers of sharp black ice. Outside the narrow opening, the howling, mournful shriek of the blizzard battered relentlessly against the fortress stone. It served as a terrifying reminder of the extremely hostile environment waiting just beyond the safety of her prison. Corenza wedged her bare toes into the uneven, freezing gaps of the granite blocks. She hoisted her frail body upward, her silver-weighted wrists making the vertical climb excruciatingly difficult. The runic cuffs slammed against the stone wall, the metallic clinks sounding terrifyingly loud to her heightened paranoid senses. She paused halfway up, holding her breath, desperately waiting for a shout of discovery from the upper servant corridors. Nothing came. The sprawling, treacherous keep remained entirely dead to her desperate struggle. She finally reached the high grate and forced her head and right arm through the narrow, unforgiving gap. The rusted iron bit fiercely into her fragile shoulder, instantly tearing through the thin, threadbare fabric of her prison tunic and ruthlessly scraping her pale skin. Corenza exhaled completely, forcing the last bit of air from her lungs, collapsing her ribcage to make herself as small as physically possible. She pushed her body forward, grinding her ribs and collarbone against the unyielding metal. It was a suffocating, terrifying squeeze. Blind panic flared wildly in her chest as she caught harshly against the ice-covered bars, trapped halfway between the freezing dungeon and the deadly storm outside. She tightly closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the burning, radiant crescent scar on her left arm. She vividly pictured Kalin riding his massive, imposing war horse through the snow, his broad, powerful shoulders coated in white frost, completely unaware of the lethal archers waiting on the high ridges above him. That visceral, terrifying image fueled her failing body. With a brutal, agonizing twist of her entire torso, Corenza violently tore herself free from the bars. She left pieces of her ruined tunic on the iron grate as she forcefully slipped through the narrow opening. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, plummeting headfirst into the absolute, blinding darkness of the violent winter night. The drop from the dungeon wall was dangerously steep, a freefall through frozen air that stole the last remnants of her breath. She crashed heavily into a massive, towering snowdrift banked against the outer foundations of the fortress. The brutal impact instantly knocked the wind from her lungs. For a terrifying moment, the young woman was completely buried alive under the suffocating, freezing weight of the localized avalanche. The absolute, biting cold of the jagged mountains swallowed her whole. It was a brutal, unforgiving temperature that bypassed her skin entirely and settled directly into her bones. Corenza frantically clawed her way to the surface, breaking through the hard crust of the snowdrift with a desperate, tearing gasp for air. The roaring blizzard was utterly deafening. The aggressive wind screamed through the jagged, treacherous mountain valleys, carrying sharp, blinding shards of ice that sliced across her exposed cheeks and forehead like tiny invisible blades. She could barely see past her own outstretched, trembling hands. The outside world was a chaotic, swirling vortex of aggressive white snow and deep, endless grey shadows. She dragged her exhausted body out of the deep drift, her bare feet sinking knee-deep into the fresh, powdery snow with every step. The severe physical shock of the sub-zero environment sent a violent, uncontrollable tremor rippling violently through her spine. Her toes instantly went numb, losing all sensation against the ice. The heavy metal locked around her wrists grew dangerously freezing to the touch, rapidly siphoning the precious residual warmth from her forearms. Without a thick fur cloak, without leather boots, and severely malnourished from weeks of starvation, stepping out into this particular storm was an undeniable, swift death sentence for any ordinary human or low-ranking wolf. But she was not an ordinary human, and she was no longer merely a broken, forgotten prisoner. She was a desperate, fiercely devoted mate. The sacred mating scar on her wrist flared with a renewed intensity that bordered on euphoric, blinding agony. The molten, golden heat radiated outward from her scarred flesh, spreading a thin, miraculous, magical layer of warmth across her shivering chest and down her freezing legs. Her awakened inner wolf, though still physically weak and completely unable to fully shift, due to the heavy silver remaining on her arms, actively projected its feral, ancestral resilience into her frail human form. Her steely vision cut through the blinding snow, locking onto the towering, treacherous silhouettes of the mountain cliffs, looming menacingly above the royal fortress. She clutched the stolen parchment of the war map, tucked securely against her chest inside her ruined tunic. The cruel words Beta Varick had spoken and the strategic lines drawn on the paper were permanently burned into her memory, meticulously mapping out the exact, deadly coordinates of the narrow gorge ambush. More importantly, the somatic, physical pull of her severed bond acted as an absolute undeniable compass in the whiteout conditions. She could feel exactly where Kalin was. The Alpha King's powerful presence was a massive, gravitational weight pulling constantly at her ribs. It presented itself as a steady, rhythmic thrumming deep in the west, a phantom heartbeat vibrating against her own sternum. He was steadily, unknowingly moving closer to the weeping cliffs, his exhausted patrol blindly marching directly into the designated death trap. Corenza took her first deliberate step into the raging blizzard. The packed snow crunched loudly under her bare heel. The biting, aggressive wind immediately attempted to push her backward, acting as a solid, physical wall of atmospheric hostility. She leaned forward, severely lowering her center of gravity, and began the grueling, torturous trek toward the distant mountain pass. The rugged terrain of this haunted range was notoriously lethal, even in the gentle, forgiving months of summer. The sheer granite walls were magnificent, beautiful in the way a freshly sharpened blade was beautiful, but utterly merciless. In the chaotic heart of a winter blizzard, it was an impossible, frozen nightmare. The path upward was not a paved road, but a series of narrow, winding goat tracks clinging precariously to the absolute edge of sheer, bottomless mountain ravines. The jagged rocks were entirely coated in a treacherous, invisible glaze of black ice, dangerously hidden beneath the shifting layers of fresh, deceptive snow. The mountains earned their name from the eerie, haunting sound the wind made as it whipped through these lethal drops, sounding like 1,000 ghostly voices warning travelers to turn back. Every single step forward required absolute agonizing concentration. Corenza's numb hands gripped the freezing granite outcroppings to physically steady herself, the heavy chains clanking softly against the stone with every movement. The deep, raw friction burns on her wrists flared fiercely as the freezing snow packed tightly into the crevices of the metal, but she dared not stop to adjust them. Precious time was rapidly slipping away. The sky above the swirling violent storm was beginning to lighten ever so slightly, slowly transitioning from the pitch black of deep night to the bruised, desolate purple of impending, tragic dawn. The patrol was strictly expected to reach the narrow gorge by the early morning light. She had to intercept his vanguard before they physically entered the narrowest, most dangerous part of the ice corridor, where retreat would become entirely impossible. A sudden, highly violent gust of wind slammed brutally into her side, nearly tearing her completely from the steep cliff face. Corenza immediately dropped to her bare knees, desperately driving her freezing fingers into a deep, icy crevice in the rock to physically anchor herself. Her frail arms screamed under the immense strain, the heavy silver cuffs digging even deeper into her bruised bones. She hung precariously over the jagged edge of a vast, unseen drop, the howling, empty void below, threatening to swallow her whole if her grip failed for even a fraction of a second. She stayed completely frozen in that desperate, clinging crouch for a long, agonizing minute, waiting for the worst of the gale to finally pass over her. Her breathing grew incredibly shallow and erratic. The numbing, absolute cold of the environment was slowly overpowering the magical, internal heat of her claiming mark, creeping steadily up her calves, and aggressively dulling the sensation in her exhausted thighs. The seductive, incredibly dangerous urge to simply lie down in the soft, welcoming snow and close her eyes began to whisper softly in the back of her deteriorating mind. It would be so incredibly easy to just let go, to let the winter quietly take her, abandoning the impossible struggle. But then a sharp, terrifying spike of pure anxiety echoed violently through her chest. It was not her own fear, it was the faint, distant but unmistakable echo of the Alpha King's massive inner wolf, feeling an unexplained, somatic panic rippling forcefully across their severed, unacknowledged connection. He did not know why he was suddenly anxious, but the sacred bond was desperately warning him that half of his very soul was currently freezing to death on a desolate mountain cliff. That shared, profound tremor of fear snapped Corenza completely out of her dangerous lethargy. She firmly gritted her teeth, tasting the familiar echo of absolute resolve. She forced her frozen, unbending knees to forcefully straighten. She pulled herself up from the perilous edge of the abyss, her piercing gaze fixed firmly on the treacherous, winding path ahead. The storm raged violently against her fragile, battered frame, but the starved Omega merely bowed her head and kept walking. She would reach the narrow gorge. She would save him. Leaving a continuous, undeniable trail of deep crimson blood in the pristine, unforgiving snow, she marched forward to rewrite destiny. The next hour dissolved into a timeless, excruciating blur of blinding white and violent grey. The frozen mountain pass of the treacherous highlands held no regard for profound courage, and it certainly harboured no sympathy for the desperate, fated devotion of a starved prisoner. The brutal blizzard acted as a solid atmospheric entity, aggressively shoving against Corenza's battered frame with the sheer, crushing force of a charging beast. Every time she managed to lift her numb, bruised foot from the deep drifts, the howling gale threatened to violently throw her completely off the narrow, treacherous cliff path. She was no longer walking so much as she was stubbornly falling forward, utilizing the heavy runic silver shackles still locked around her wrists as crude, agonizing anchors against the jagged granite walls. The deep, raw friction burns circling her forearms had long since stopped bleeding normally. The severe, sub-zero temperature of the high altitude instantly crystallized her blood the moment it breached her torn skin, leaving a horrifying, undeniable trail of dark, frozen crimson smeared across the pristine, deceptive snow. She offered no whimpers to the empty void. She shed no tears, for the biting wind would have instantly frozen them against her bruised cheeks, sealing her eyes shut. Her survival required an absolute, terrifying compartmentalization of her own physical agony. The celestial bond mark on her left wrist was no longer merely a source of comforting warmth. It had evolved into a demanding, tyrannical furnace. Because her mortal body was completely starved, having subsisted on nothing but meager scraps and stagnant dungeon water for weeks, the ancient magic had absolutely no physical reserves left to safely consume. Thus, it began to aggressively cannibalize her very life force to sustain the connection. The crescent scar glowed with a terrifying, blinding incandescence through the shredded remains of her tunic. It pumped a frantic, searing heat into her veins, but that miraculous warmth came at a devastating, terminal cost. With every erratic, struggling beat of her failing heart, the young woman could physically feel her inner wolf dying. The beast was sacrificing its own essence, burning itself alive on the altar of her soul, just to keep her human legs moving for one more mile. The heavy silver cuffs were no longer merely cold. They had achieved a terrifying thermal equilibrium with the blizzard, turning into twin rings of solid ice that adhered permanently to her torn flesh. When she forced her exhausted arms to move to grip the rock face, she could hear the sickening, wet sound of her own skin tearing away, left behind on the cursed metal. The toxic, violet suppression runes carved into the restraints continued to pulse, fighting a vicious, localized war against the golden heat of her claiming mark. The resulting magical clash ripped through her compromised nervous system like a continuous lightning strike. The air she dragged into her lungs felt exactly like inhaled glass. Her alveoli were rapidly beginning to freeze, making every single exhalation a harsh, wet rattle that sounded terrifyingly loud in the absolute isolation of the mountain pass. To keep her deteriorating mind from shattering into complete delirium, Corenza visualized the stolen war map. She overlaid the harsh, geometric lines of Beta Varix parchment directly onto the chaotic, swirling nightmare of the weeping cliffs surrounding her. She knew she was getting agonizingly close to the designated ambush zone. The rugged terrain was beginning to narrow significantly, the towering, sheer granite walls of the gorge slowly rising on either side of the treacherous goat track like the jaws of a colossal stone trap. She calculated the remaining distance with a desperate, feverish logic. She tracked the shifting, diffuse light bleeding through the heavy storm clouds. The deep, oppressive black of the winter night was slowly fading, replaced by a sickly, bruised purple that signaled the tragic approach of dawn. The royal patrol was strictly expected to reach the narrowest point of the gorge at first light. Time had become a massive physical weight, crushing down on her fragile collarbone right alongside the heavy enchanted iron. Her mind began to play cruel, seductive tricks on her failing senses as hypothermia took a deeper hold. She thought she saw her late mother, standing in the deep snowdrifts, holding a warm, glowing lantern and softly whispering the old ancestral survival hymns. She thought she felt the soft plush furs of a grand royal bed beneath her bleeding, frost-bitten knees, inviting her to rest. The profound cognitive dissonance of extreme cold was actively trying to soothe her into a quiet, painless death. The incredibly dangerous urge to simply lie down in the soft, welcoming snow and close her eyes roared in her ears, louder than the relentless blizzard. It would be so incredibly easy to just let go, to let the winter quietly claim her broken body and abandon the impossible struggle against destiny. Then, her frail body finally reached the absolute limit of biological endurance. A violent gust of wind caught her right shoulder, spinning her off balance just as her numb foot slipped on a hidden patch of black ice. Corenza's knees violently buckled. She crashed heavily into the packed snow, the breath driven entirely from her failing lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The world tilted dangerously, then completely went black for a terrifying, unmeasured span of time. She lay there, in the deep drift, her torn, bleeding cheek pressed firmly against the freezing, unforgiving ice. The heavy snow immediately began to bury her, quietly erasing her small, insignificant form from the harsh landscape. But the somatic pull deeply rooted in her chest violently jerked her awake. The invisible tether connecting her soul to the Alpha King thrummed with an overwhelming, absolute proximity. He was right there, just below the ridge. She could not stop now, not when the phantom vibration of his heartbeat was echoing directly against her own sternum. With a raw, guttural sound of pure defiance, the Omega dug her bleeding, frostbitten fingers deeply into the solid ice. She could no longer stand, so she crawled, dragging the immense weight of the silver chains, hauling her shattered, unresponsive legs behind her. She pulled her ruined body forward, inch by agonizing inch, leaving a wide, unbroken smear of crimson across the treacherous threshold of the weeping cliffs. 5 miles below the treacherous ridgeline, the royal vanguard of Ironfall Keep moved like a solemn, exhausted procession of ghosts through the blinding whiteout. King Kalin Thornemere rode at the direct center of the armored column, his massive, imposing silhouette cutting a dark, authoritative void through the swirling storm. Draped in heavy, obsidian furs and thick, ancestral steel, the Alpha King projected an aura of absolute, unshakable dominance. His winter storm eyes, sharp and relentlessly calculating, continuously scanned the hostile environment. He was a sovereign who carried the crushing, immense burden of a fractured kingdom on his broad shoulders, a ruler who had long ago sacrificed his own personal peace for the sheer survival of his people. The men riding beside him were his elite guard, the fiercest warriors in the northern territories, yet even they were visibly bowing under the severe, exhausting toll of the unseasonal blizzard. For years, Kalin had silently endured the quiet, devastating agony of a severed soul, the sacred fated mate bond, the legendary connection meant to anchor an alpha's terrifying power, had always been a dead, hollow void inside his chest. He had searched the 3 realms endlessly during his early reign, hunting for the woman who carried the other half of his spirit, only to find absolutely nothing. For years, he believed the hollow mark on his soul didn't just contain his immense, volatile power. It created a deliberate void, an intentional absence where his capacity for warmth should be. He had eventually accepted his tragic fate, sealing his heart securely behind walls of impenetrable ice, fully believing that his mate had either died before he could find her, or had simply never been born. He led his fierce wolves with cold, flawless logic, forcibly burying the feral, yearning part of his beast beneath heavy layers of royal duty and military strategy. The transition from absolute, ironclad control to complete, feral chaos happened in a fraction of a heartbeat. Without a single external warning, Kalin's massive warhorse suddenly threw its heavy head back, letting out a shrill, terrified whinny as it instinctively shied away from an invisible force. Simultaneously, a violent, world-ending agony exploded directly behind the king's sternum. It was not a physical wound from an unseen archer hidden in the cliffs. It was a devastating, somatic strike to his very soul. Kalin violently doubled over in the heavy leather saddle, his thick, gloved hands flying to his chest as a harsh, ragged gasp was forcefully torn from his throat. The pain was absolute, blinding, and terrifyingly intimate. It felt exactly as though someone had taken a serrated blade of pure, burning sunlight and driven it directly into the frozen, empty void of his unacknowledged mate bond. The sudden, explosive surge of connection was so overwhelmingly powerful that it completely bypassed his meticulously constructed mental defenses. His legendary inner beast, widely feared as the most ruthless and dominant predator in the Northern Territories, did not respond with its usual aggressive fury. Instead, the massive wolf dropped entirely to its mental knees within his mind and let out a howling, desperate cry of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a raw, primal panic that Kalin had never experienced in his entire life. The beast was frantically clawing at the inside of his ribs, driven completely mad by the sudden, overwhelming flood of sensory data pouring through the newly awakened tether. His mate was out there. She existed. She was real, and she was currently dying. The sudden, miraculous realization of her existence was instantaneously overshadowed by the horrifying somatic feedback actively flooding his royal nervous system. Because the bond had been forced open by her sheer, sacrificial desperation, Kalin did not just sense her distant distress. He physically felt her catastrophic suffering. He felt the sickening, toxic bite of silver suppression magic burning viciously in his own veins, turning his royal blood to acid. He felt the devastating, numbing grip of severe frostbite eating away at his extremities, making his powerful hands tremble violently against the reins. He tasted the bitter, metallic tang of chewed iron and fresh blood on the back of his own tongue, and most terrifying of all, he felt the faint, erratic, violently stuttering rhythm of a fragile heart that was actively, undeniably shutting down. "Halt the column," the king roared, his voice cracking with a raw, feral desperation that his elite guards had never, ever heard before. The entire vanguard slammed to a sudden, confused stop, the heavy warhorses stamping nervously in the deep, shifting snow. The elite warriors instantly drew their gleaming steel weapons, forming a tight, protective circle around their sovereign, their seasoned eyes frantically searching the blinding storm for an enemy ambush. The clatter of armor and the harsh commands of the captains echoed sharply against the towering granite walls. They assumed their king had been struck by a hidden projectile, or that a rogue faction was advancing through the whiteout. But there were no enemy soldiers visible in the snow. The immediate threat was not a physical army attacking their flanks. Kalin barely registered the protective presence of his own men. His winter storm eyes suddenly flared, rapidly bleeding into a terrifying, luminous, molten gold. The feral, ancient instincts of the Alpha completely overrode the calm, strategic logic of the king. He practically tore the heavy leather reins from his horse's bit, his massive chest heaving, as if he had just run 100 miles barefoot through the ice. The thick, obsidian fur of his cloak seemed to bristle aggressively, responding to the volatile, ambient magic leaking directly from his pores. The temperature immediately surrounding the sovereign began to rapidly drop even further, his icy, ancestral royal magic reacting violently to the severe threat against his unacknowledged queen. Frost aggressively crept up the dark neck of his warhorse, spreading outward in a terrifying circular shockwave that instantly froze the falling snowflakes mid-air, suspending them like shards of shattered glass. The invisible, somatic tether was now wrapped securely around his lungs, violently pulling him forward. It was dragging his entire focus toward the towering, narrow weeping cliffs of the gorge just ahead of them. His beast was thrashing wildly, refusing to maintain formation, refusing to follow standard patrol protocol. Through the blinding, chaotic swirl of the blizzard, a new scent completely overpowered the smell of wet pine and freezing stone. It was a faint, delicate scent of sweet rain, old rust, and fresh, devastatingly rich crimson blood. The scent was carrying directly on the brutal wind, cutting straight through the overwhelming atmospheric hostility. It was her. The other half of his soul was bleeding out in the ice, dragging herself toward the designated death trap to save his life, and she was agonizingly close. He did not order his men to stand down. He did not issue a tactical command to secure the perimeter. He simply drove his heavy boots fiercely into his warhorse's flanks, breaking the strict military formation with a violent, explosive surge of speed. The massive beast launched itself forward into the deepest part of the snowdrifts, abandoning the safety of the armored vanguard. The Alpha King was no longer a sovereign leading a routine border check. He was a feral, desperate monster, tearing blindly through the mountain pass, racing against a failing heartbeat that was completely, entirely intertwined with his own. The ground beneath Corenza's bleeding, frost-bitten fingers began to vibrate. It was a subtle, rhythmic tremor at first, entirely masked by the deafening howl of the mountain's blizzard. But the violent vibration steadily grew, traveling through the solid, unforgiving black ice and reverberating directly against her hollowed sternum. The phantom heartbeat that had been torturing her severed soul for miles was suddenly, terrifyingly real. The young Omega could no longer lift her head. Her exhausted eyes were practically sealed shut by thick crusts of frozen tears and crystallized ice. Her frail, starved body had completely bypassed the threshold of physical agony, slipping into a detached, floating numbness that signaled the absolute end of her biological endurance. Yet her dormant lunar magic refused to let her die in the snow. The crescent claiming mark on her left wrist flared with one final agonizing surge of molten, golden heat. It acted as a desperate, burning beacon in the chaotic whiteout, screaming across the invisible tether to the sovereign, who was unknowingly galloping toward his own doom. A massive, shadowy silhouette suddenly tore through the aggressive curtain of the winter storm. The towering warhorse was a terrifying creature of muscle and thick obsidian fur, its heavy hooves striking the jagged granite with bone-shattering force. The beast let out a wild, shrill shriek as the rider violently hauled back on the heavy leather reins. The magnificent animal reared onto its hind legs, its front hooves thrashing the freezing air mere inches from the shattered prisoner crawling across the icy threshold. But the Alpha King did not wait for the horse to stabilize. Kalin Thorne practically threw himself from the high saddle while the beast was still moving. He did not execute a graceful tactical dismount. The formidable sovereign hit the packed snow with the uncoordinated, desperate momentum of a falling boulder. His heavy, ancestral steel knee pads slammed into the solid ice with a sickening crack, fracturing the frozen ground beneath his immense weight. The temperature immediately surrounding the fallen monarch plummeted to impossible, unnatural depths. Kalin's feral winterstorm magic bled uncontrollably from his broad shoulders, reacting violently to the devastating sensory data, flooding his newly awakened fated bond. The blinding snow around them instantly halted in midair, suspended by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of his panic. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning his royal dignity. His massive, armored frame cast a dark, protective shadow over the tiny, ruined girl collapsed in the drift. When his winter storm eyes finally locked onto her physical form, the breath was violently punched from his lungs. She was so incredibly small. Her threadbare prison tunic was shredded to ribbons, offering absolutely no protection against the sub-zero atmosphere. But it was her hands that made the legendary, ruthless king let out a raw, guttural sound of pure horror. The thick, magically forged silver cuffs were still securely locked around her bruised, emaciated wrists. The heavy anchor chains had been frantically chewed and broken through, leaving jagged, rusted links dangling uselessly from the runic metal. Her pale skin bore the terrible, undeniable marks where the cursed restraints had held her, creating a horrifying testament to the absolute lengths she had gone to escape. Kalin reached out with trembling, heavily gauntleted hands. The most feared predator in the Northern Territories was suddenly terrified to touch her, paralyzed by the agonizing fear that his massive strength would shatter her fragile, frozen bones. The golden heat radiating from her scarred wrist clashed violently with his own icy aura, creating a sizzling, tangible mist of ambient magic between their bodies. He stripped his heavy obsidian fur cloak from his own shoulders with frantic, jerky movements, immediately wrapping the thick, luxurious pelt securely around her shivering, battered form. Corenza did not lean into the inviting, desperate warmth of his chest. She actively fought the seductive pull of unconsciousness, forcing her cracked, bleeding lips to part. The metallic tang of rusted iron and faint blood coated her tongue, making speech incredibly difficult. She had not endured the freezing outer dungeon cells. She had not sacrificed her own physical limits, and she had not crawled through a merciless blizzard just to be comforted. She aggressively bypassed the sacred, soul-deep yearning of their connection, focusing every last, dying ounce of her willpower on the mission. Her numb, heavily weighed fingers twitched inside the folds of the heavy fur. She managed to blindly drag the stolen, blood-stained parchment from the shredded collar of her tunic. She shoved the crumpled war map directly against his cold steel breastplate. The physical contact sent a blinding, electric shockwave of pure energy up her arm, but she refused to acknowledge the sudden surge of the bond. "Varek," she rasped, her voice barely a dry haunting whisper against the roaring gale, the beta sold you to the ice. She forced her dull, metallic eyes to open, desperately searching the blurred, massive features of the man who held the other half of her soul. Archers are waiting on the high ridge. The narrow gorge is a trap. Do not go further. The Alpha King stared down at the ruined parchment, pressed against his armor. The strategic lines and treacherous coordinates were heavily smeared with her own dark, frozen blood. The realization of what she had done struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. She had sacrificed everything, risking her own fragile life to deliver a warning that his own highly paid spies and elite generals had completely missed. No woman lasted a night with him, the cruel nobles had whispered in the capital, but one woman did. One outcast, forgotten prisoner had lasted a lifetime of invisible agony, enduring the absolute worst of his corrupt kingdom, only to drag herself through a frozen hell to save his life. Her duty was finally fulfilled. The frantic, desperate adrenaline that had fueled Corenza's impossible trek instantly evaporated into the freezing air. The glowing crescent on her wrist gave one final, violent throb of golden light before fading into a terrifying, dormant grey. The sheer physical toll of her starvation, the silver suppression, and the extreme hypothermia crashed down upon her fragile nervous system all at once. Her clouded irises rolled backward, her head fell limply against Kalin's armored bicep. The faint, stuttering rhythm of her heartbeat, the delicate pulse that the king had been tracking for 5 agonizing miles, suddenly staggered, slowed to an impossible crawl, and stopped completely. Absolute, deafening silence descended upon Kalin Thornemere's mind. The severed soul bond went completely, terrifyingly dark. For a fraction of a second, the sovereign simply knelt there in the snow, clutching the lifeless body of his true Luna against his chest. His brain could not mathematically process the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the loss. Then, the fragile, meticulous walls of his humanity snapped entirely. The calculated, strategic monarch died on the weeping cliffs of the howling summit, completely incinerated by the volatile, exploding fury of his ancestral bloodline. Because when he saw her lying there, broken and abandoned by the very pack he was sworn to protect, something inside him roared that he had to save her, even if saving her meant destroying the entire world. A sharp, piercing whistle suddenly cut through the howling wind. The ambush had been triggered prematurely. High up on the treacherous, invisible ridges, Beta Varric's hidden commanders realized that the Royal Patrol had abruptly halted just outside the designated kill zone. Panic rippled through the conspirators' ranks. A volley of black-fletched arrows rained down from the blinding whiteout, whistling aggressively toward the vulnerable, stationary target of the kneeling king. Kalin did not even look up. He merely extended his right hand over Corenza's fragile, fur-wrapped body. The latent, terrifying power of the Thornemere lineage erupted from his palm in a massive, concussive shockwave of solid frost. A colossal, impenetrable dome of thick glacial ice instantly materialized over them, expanding outward with the explosive force of a detonating blast. The deadly arrows shattered harmlessly against the frozen barrier, the wooden shafts instantly crystallizing and turning to fine, sparkling dust upon impact. The king gently, reverently lowered his mate's head onto the softest patch of deep snow beneath the protective dome. He brushed a frozen strand of hair away from her pale cheek, his massive, heavily scarred fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw with an agonizing, desperate tenderness. "Breathe," he commanded her, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that physically shook the granite stones beneath them. "I forbid you from leaving me. Breathe, my queen, I will return." Kalin stood up to his full, towering height. He stepped outside the boundary of the glacial shield, leaving the fragile sanctuary of his protective magic. The winter-storm eyes of the Alpha King were gone, entirely swallowed by a terrifying, luminous expanse of feral, molten gold. His jaw elongated, his heavy armor straining violently as the massive, legendary beast beneath his skin demanded absolute release. He did not draw his ancestral broadsword. Weapons were for soldiers and knights. What the sovereign intended to do required the raw, merciless fury of an apex predator defending its fallen mate. The snowdrifts surrounding the narrow path suddenly erupted. Dozens of heavily armed mercenaries, paid and positioned by the treacherous Beta, surged forward from their concealed trenches. They charged blindly toward the lone sovereign, their battle axes and hooked spears glinting menacingly in the sickly, bruised purple light of the impending dawn. They believed they held the superior tactical advantage. They believed they were hunting a trapped, exhausted patrol. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked completely unarmed into the inescapable domain of a grieving monster. The Alpha King launched himself directly into the center of the advancing horde. He moved with a horrifying, supernatural velocity that completely defied his immense, heavily armored bulk. His heavy gauntlets struck the first line of attackers with devastating, visceral efficiency. He did not employ formal martial arts. He simply grabbed the closest mercenary by the heavy armor, tossing the man aside with bone-jarring force. Another attacker swung a heavy broadsword toward the king's exposed flank. Kalin caught the sharpened steel blade directly with his bare, gauntlet-stripped hand. The mercenary's eyes widened in sheer terror as the sovereign's icy magic instantly traveled up the metal weapon, freezing the man's arms solid before the beast violently incapacitated him with a brutal, sweeping strike. The king tore through the conspirators' ranks like a localized hurricane of fangs and ancestral frost. He ripped through their heavy leather armor with unrelenting, terrifying ease, acting as a silent force of nature, exacting absolute poetic retribution. The mercenaries began to panic, dropping their weapons in blind fear, as they finally realized the sheer, catastrophic error of their treason. They tried to turn and flee back into the blinding storm, scrambling desperately up the icy, treacherous inclines. Kalin did not let a single one of them escape. The invisible, ambient temperature of the gorge plummeted again, responding to his feral, commanding roar. The black ice beneath the fleeing traitors suddenly shifted and spiked, creating massive, insurmountable pillars of solid frost that encased the retreating soldiers exactly where they stood. The desperate cries of the defeated echoed sharply against the towering granite walls, completely drowning out the mournful shriek of the blizzard. The mountain pass was transformed into a silent, frozen monument to his wrath within minutes. A safe distance down the mountain pass, the elite royal vanguard finally broke through the heavy snowdrifts. The fierce warriors of Ironfall Keep reigned in their exhausted warhorses, their seasoned eyes widening in absolute, stunned awe. They did not need to draw their weapons. They did not need to form a defensive perimeter. The battle was already entirely over. The narrow gorge was completely littered with the frozen, incapacitated forms of Varek's hidden army. In the dead center of the brutal aftermath, the Alpha King stood surrounded by the total ruin of his enemies. His massive chest heaved with ragged, violent breaths, the molten gold in his eyes burning with an unquenchable, savage fury. Yet, the moment the immediate threat was completely neutralized, the terrifying, feral beast vanished instantly. Kalin practically collapsed in on himself, the adrenaline leaving his massive frame in a sudden, violent rush. He ignored his stunned commanders. He ignored the torn remnants of his own armor. The Sovereign turned his back on the battlefield and scrambled frantically back toward the glacial dome he had erected, desperate to return to the only thing in the three realms that actually mattered. He fell heavily to his knees beside Corenza's still, silent form. The absolute, merciless destroyer of the northern territories vanished, replaced entirely by a broken, weeping man. He gathered the tiny, frozen Omega into his massive arms, pulling her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her icy, bruised neck, his broad shoulders shaking with deep, agonizing sobs. He completely stripped off his remaining armor, pressing his bare, burning skin directly against her freezing flesh, desperately trying to force his own volatile royal magic into her hollow, dormant, claiming mark. He would not accept her silence. He would force the universe to rewrite its cruel ending, pouring every ounce of his ancestral soul into her shattered body until her heart remembered how to beat. The elite warriors of the royal vanguard did not dare ask their sovereign to move. Instead, they moved the world around him, working with frantic, terrified precision in the brutal aftermath of the gorge. The heavily armored commanders rapidly erected the massive royal pavilion directly over the Alpha King and his fallen mate. Thick, heavy canvas and overlapping layers of insulated bear pelts were swiftly anchored into the fractured ice, instantly constructing a formidable, wind-proof sanctuary right in the center of the weeping cliffs. Heavy brass braziers were hauled inside and ignited, filling the cavernous interior with the rich, sharp scent of burning cedar and crackling pine. The violent, howling shriek of the wailing range was immediately muffled, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of the enclosed command tent. The fierce guards retreated without a single word, securely lacing the heavy flaps shut. They left their terrifying monarch entirely alone in the dim, flickering light, kneeling on the thick furs with the broken, frozen Omega clutched desperately to his chest. Kalin Thornemere did not care about the secured perimeter. He spared no concern for the frozen mercenaries outside, nor the treacherous Beta who had orchestrated his near destruction. He only cared about the terrifyingly still, silent girl in his arms. Her fragile body was entirely unresponsive, her lifeless silver eyes closed beneath thick, dark lashes coated in crystallized frost. The Alpha King carefully shifted her weight, laying her gently against the mountain of luxurious royal furs. His massive, scarred hands violently trembled as he reached for the ruined, blood-soaked remnants of her prison tunic, tearing the freezing fabric away to fully expose the catastrophic damage inflicted upon her frail frame. The heavy, magically forged silver cuffs were still securely locked around her emaciated wrists. The anchor chains had been savagely broken, but the runic metal rings remained, biting deeply into her pale, torn flesh. The toxic, sickly violet light of the suppression runes pulsed weakly against her skin, continuously pumping a debilitating, freezing venom directly into her completely exhausted bloodstream. Kalin let out a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated agony as he gently lifted her right arm, his glowing, molten gold eyes focused entirely on the jagged, rusted edges of the broken chain links. He recognized the distinct, horrifying scrape of human teeth marks, scored deeply into the enchanted iron. The realization struck the Sovereign with the devastating force of a physical blow. She had not found a key. She had not picked the ancient locks. She had deliberately, violently chewed through her own magical captivity, physically mutilating her own body just for the desperate chance to run through a blizzard and save his life. The Alpha King did not search for a key either. The feral, ancient magic of the Thornemere bloodline erupted from his broad shoulders, transforming his immense grief into a localized hurricane of volatile power. He wrapped his large, bare hands directly around the freezing, cursed silver binding her left wrist. The toxic violet runes instantly flared, reacting aggressively to his touch, sending a searing, blinding wave of acidic pain shooting directly up his forearms. Kalin completely ignored the agonizing burn. He gritted his teeth, his heavy jaw locking as he channeled the sheer, absolute dominance of his inner beast into his physical grip. With a savage, terrifying roar that vibrated the heavy canvas walls, he forcibly bent the enchanted metal backward. The ancient, unbreakable silver shrieked under the impossible pressure before violently snapping in half, falling away from her bruised skin in two useless, shattered pieces. He immediately repeated the brutal process on her right arm, ripping the second cuff away and casting the cursed restraints into the darkest corner of the tent. But removing the metal was not enough. The deep, raw friction burns circling her forearms were completely blackened by severe frostbite, and the silver venom had already settled deep within her veins. Kalin frantically stripped off his heavy gauntlets and the last remnants of his torn undertunic, exposing his broad, heavily scarred chest to the warm cedar air. He pressed his glowing, burning palms directly over the hollow, dormant crescent scar on her left wrist. The fated mate bond, which had gone terrifyingly dark moments ago, acted as a highly conductive, somatic bridge between their souls. He did not merely try to warm her skin. He actively forced his own volatile, ancestral life force into her failing body, deliberately absorbing the toxic suppression magic into his own massive frame. The excruciating transfer caused the Sovereign to violently shudder. Dark, violet veins immediately crawled up his muscular forearms as the silver poison entered his system, attempting to freeze his royal blood. He welcomed the excruciating agony. He anchored himself completely in the pain, using it as a desperate tether to drag her fading spirit back from the freezing void. "Do not leave me in the dark," the king whispered, his voice cracking with deep, agonizing sobs. He leaned forward, burying his face in the crook of her icy, bruised neck, his hot tears falling freely against her pale collarbone. "I will burn this entire kingdom to the ground. I will tear the stars from the sky and lay them at your feet, but you will not leave me. You are mine. You are my soul. Come back to me." For a long, terrifying span of time, the command pavilion remained utterly still, save for the ragged, desperate sound of the king's weeping. But slowly, miraculously, the ambient magic within the heavy canvas sanctuary began to shift. The dormant crescent scar on Corenza's wrist, which had been a block of dead, numbing grey, faintly flickered. The crescent scar absorbed the torrential flood of his molten, golden devotion, sparking to life like a dying ember, catching a sudden violent gust of pure oxygen. The searing heat radiated outward from her wrist, flushing the severe, deadly pallor from her frostbitten cheeks. The dark, crystallized blood on her forearms began to melt, replaced by the natural, healthy flush of restored circulation, and then, beneath the heavy, desperate weight of the king's palm, her fragile chest suddenly hitched. Corenza Thorne drew in a sharp, ragged, desperate breath. The first sensation that registered in her deeply battered mind was not the biting, merciless frost of the outer dungeon cells. It was an overwhelming, suffocating blanket of absolute radiant heat. The scent of damp granite and ancient rust was entirely gone, replaced by the rich, intoxicating aroma of burning cedar, spiced wine, and the deep territorial musk of a powerful, commanding alpha. She slowly, painfully forced her heavy eyelids to flutter open. The flickering, golden light of the brass braziers briefly blinded her, forcing her to blink against the sudden, unfamiliar brightness. She expected to see the rusted iron grates of her subterranean prison. She expected to feel the agonizing, heavy weight of the silver chains, dragging her frail arms down into the freezing dirt. Instead, she felt the incredibly soft, luxurious texture of pristine bare pelts cocooning her entire body. Her severely injured wrists were entirely free, the deep, agonizing wounds already wrapped in pristine, white linen bandages that radiated a soothing, magical warmth. The hollow mark on her skin no longer created a void, an absence where her magic should be. It was overflowing with a molten, golden resonance that anchored her entirely to the present. The severe somatic deprivation that had tortured her for weeks was completely erased, replaced by an absolute, unshakable feeling of profound safety. She weakly turned her head against the soft fur pillow. Beside her low cot, the most feared, ruthless predator in the three realms was kneeling directly on the wooden floorboards. Kalin Thornemere was completely stripped of his intimidating, ancestral armor. His broad, powerful shoulders were slumped in a posture of total, unreserved exhaustion. His heavy head was bowed low, his dark hair falling across his face as he gently held her bandaged hand between his two massive palms. He was pressing his forehead desperately against her knuckles, his large frame trembling with quiet, residual tremors. "The map," Corenza rasped, her voice incredibly weak and hoarse from the freezing wind. The Alpha King violently flinched at the sound of her voice. His head snapped up, his winter storm eyes completely rimmed in red, overflowing with fresh, uncontrolled tears. The terrifying feral beast who had just decimated an entire army with his bare hands looked at her with an expression of such pure, devastating vulnerability that it completely stole the breath from her healing lungs. "The ambush is broken, my queen," Kalin murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that physically resonated against her skin. He did not release her hand. He merely adjusted his grip, holding her delicate fingers as if they were the only things tethering him to reality. "Varric's forces are entirely frozen in the gorge. The traitor will be dragged back to the capital in heavy iron. You saved the vanguard. You saved the kingdom." He swallowed hard, a fresh tear tracking down his heavily scarred cheek. "You saved me." Corenza stared at the kneeling sovereign in quiet, stunned disbelief. She had spent her entire life believing a girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. She had accepted her miserable fate as an invisible, discarded Omega, fully expecting to quietly freeze to death in the outer cells while the royal court drank honeyed wine in the high halls. But the towering monarch was not looking at her as a servant. He was not looking at her as a broken, defective wolf, because absolute monarchs do not kneel to speak to outcasts, because they do not weep over broken servants, because monsters do not look at her the way he currently did. "They locked you in the dark," the king whispered, his voice breaking as he gently reached out, his corlused thumb softly brushing a lingering bruise on her pale cheek. "My own pack cast you into the freezing stone, and I was entirely blind to it. I felt the void in my chest for years, believing the moon goddess had cursed me to rule in absolute isolation. I did not know they were slowly killing my soul in my own dungeons." His molten gold eyes burned with a fierce, agonizing regret. "I will dismantle Ironfall, Keep stone by stone. I will execute every single guard, every noble, every elder who dared to look away while you starved. I will drown the northern territories in blood if you ask it of me, Corenza. She did not flinch away from his violent, terrifying promise of retribution. Instead, she recognized the absolute, unwavering devotion burning behind his feral words. He was actively yielding his immense royal authority directly to her fragile hands, offering her the complete power to unmake the very society that had tormented her. The fated mate bond throbbed beautifully between them, a steady, rhythmic pulse of pure, unadulterated truth. He was not lying. He was completely, irreversibly bound to her quiet strength. No, the young Omega replied flatly, her storm cloud gaze locking onto his. Her voice was weak, but it carried the undeniable, ancestral weight of a true sovereign. You will not destroy the keep. There is an elder servant, Braina Frostwood. She risked the gallows to bring me water in the dark. Corenza slowly shifted her hand, turning her palm upward to gently rest her bandaged fingers against the king's rough, stubbled jaw. You will elevate those who showed mercy, and you will force the others to watch me rule. Kalin let out a shuddering, breathless exhale. He leaned heavily into her gentle touch, closing his eyes as a profound, overwhelming peace finally settled over his chaotic, fractured mind. The gentle beast completely surrendered to her quiet, undeniable authority. As you command, my Luna, he whispered against her palm, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her bandaged skin. Always as you command. The heavy canvas flaps of the command pavilion suddenly rustled, breaking the intimate, heavy silence. The supreme commander of the elite vanguard stepped hesitantly into the warm tent, his heavy steel armor clanking softly. He held a sealed parchment in his gauntleted hand, likely a frantic communication from the capital regarding the failed coup. But the seasoned, battle-hardened general immediately froze in his tracks. His eyes widened in absolute, staggering shock as he witnessed the terrifying Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the ruthless warlord who bowed to no god and no empire, kneeling entirely submissively on the wooden floorboards at the bedside of a scarred, emaciated girl. The commander quickly averted his eyes, instinctively moving to step backward out of the royal sanctuary to preserve his king's fierce dignity. "Stay, Commander," Kalin ordered. His voice did not raise in volume, but the low, authoritative frequency of the Alpha instantly commanded absolute obedience. The king did not scramble to his feet. He did not attempt to hide his tear-stained face or his kneeling posture. Instead, Kalin Thorne proudly remained on the floor, his large hands resting protectively over Corenza's healing waist. He slowly turned his head to look at his stunned general, his winter storm eyes flashing with absolute, terrifying clarity. "Send a raven to the High Council in the capital. Inform the noble houses that the traitor Varek is defeated." The sovereign paused, his gaze shifting back to the quiet, resilient girl who had physically dragged herself through a freezing hell to rewrite their destiny. He smiled, a soft, heartbreakingly genuine expression that completely transformed his harsh, angular features. "And tell them to prepare the ancestral high altar," the Alpha King commanded, his voice echoing with undeniable, world-bending finality. "Tell them to open the grand gates. Because the Alpha King has finally discovered the truth, and he is bringing his true queen home." Corenza Thorne lay back against the thick, luxurious bear pelts as the commander bowed deeply, lower than he had ever bowed before, and silently retreated into the snow. The howling blizzard outside the heavy canvas walls had finally begun to break, the violent winds dying down as the soft, golden light of the morning sun pierced through the heavy storm clouds. The freezing, desolate winter that had trapped her in the dark for so long was permanently over. She closed her eyes, listening to the strong, steady, incredibly safe heartbeat of the monster who had hoped for her survival, knowing that she would never, ever be cold again.